Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment, for the Sony a7 Mark IV. This camera launched at the end of 2021. It is the latest addition to Sony's lineup of full-frame mirrorless cameras. It retails for roughly $2,500 US, and I'll include a link in the description. Now, for those of you that are wondering whether or not it is worth its increased asking price, and I say that because, of course, the camera that it replaces in Sony's lineup, the a7 III, which was widely adored, retailed for $2,000 at launch. So we are at a higher price point, a significantly higher one, but I can tell you now it is an improvement in literally just about every way over the previous generation. So I do think it's worth $2,500, and as I said in my first look at this camera, I did wonder whether or not if I would have been apt to pick one up had I not already purchased an FX3. And that's because not only did this camera improve with regard to still performance, but of course with regard to video. And that's what makes it, in my opinion, one of, if not the best hybrid camera here in 2022, not just for its price, but for its feature set overall. So let's just recap what this camera has to offer in terms of specifications. We have a new 33 megapixel sensor. That is a significant jump over the 24 megapixel sensor in the a7 III. Still 10 frames per shooting, a revamped autofocus system with better eye autofocus, as well as transition, at least per Sony, but that's also been my experience when shooting subjects, as well as improved in-body image stabilization. We also now have active steady shot. We also, I would say most impressively, have a whole new ability when it comes to video, because not only do we have 4K 60, granted it is cropped, which is one of the biggest complaints I think for hybrid users, or really video users that are trying to make this a video centric camera. You still get 10-bit across every other capable format on this camera. So I think that's a really big improvement when you think of the 8-bit realm that the a7 used to occupy, and now to have 10-bit essentially across the board, I think is a beautiful thing. In addition to that, we also have H.265 beyond H.264, so more flexibility there, HEIF, and in addition to that, we have, of course, an improved EVF 3.69 million dots and over 1 million dots on the now touchscreen LCD that is fully articulating. It does come all the way out like the a7S, Mark III, and other cameras like my FX3, and you have the new menu system, and I'll be getting to that through the course of this video. Those are all big improvements. An increased buffer is another nice thing that it has. Battery life has taken a hit, but that's kind of a given when you take a camera like this, throw the kitchen sink at it, which in my opinion they have versus the previous generation, but you're still using the same battery type. So something's got to give, and if we don't get a new battery, there are only so many ways to make sure that this can be as efficient as possible. Other things you should be aware of is that we have improved color science, and I think this really does amount to a camera that no one is going to dislike. That doesn't mean that it's perfect, because it isn't. We also have the benefit of really, I feel, having a mini A1. Now, mini, I mean, it's $2,500. It's not anywhere near the asking price of the A1, but it really does mirror the A1 in terms of performance, of course, without the ability to achieve it. It's really, I feel, what the A1 could be at a $2,500 price point. That's what it represents. So an improved sensor with a higher megapixel count, improved autofocus, improved EVF, improved video capabilities, improved touchscreen display, and no recording video limitations. Granted, overheating is still a thing, so if you're wondering if that will be the ultimate limitation, I'll get to that a little bit later. It's still there. But again, at $2,500, hard-pressed to find a better camera in 2022. And there are other options. I'll likely end up doing a comparison to the a7R IV, since I know that is something a lot of people are eyeing and trying to figure out whether or not that's right, but I don't want to digress too much. So I tested this with a wide array of glass. The 24 to 105 G lens you see here, the new 70 to 200 f2.8 Mark II, as well as my G Master 1 to 400, my G Series 2 to 600, and even some prime glass as well. The end result here is that it excels in both still and video. There really isn't anything for me to get overly concerned with about its performance. The build quality, transitioning to a body that far more resembles the A1, I think is a great step. And that's part of the reason, besides the overall performance, that I point to the A1 in terms of what this camera aims to achieve. When it comes to video, as good as those improvements are, you still have to be aware of some pitfalls. For example, I mentioned earlier that 4K 60 crop. Now, my personal feelings about that, and of course I don't have that with the FX3 that I'm filming on now, and I wouldn't compare the FX3 to this camera, even though I made mention that this would have been a compelling option to me prior to buying the FX3, is frankly because the FX3 is designed to be a video camera, and that's what I needed. Would I have liked a hybrid that could have also doubled as a phenomenal still camera? Sure. Did I need it, considering I have an a7R2 and a7R4 there in the background as my hand dominates the focus? Absolutely not. I didn't need it, so I don't have regrets. But again, if I were in a position where I did not own the a7R2 or 4, then this would have been really appealing. However, that's where overheating comes in, and unfortunately, it is real. Yes, you can play with the thresholds, you can turn off, and essentially, like every Sony camera in years past, increase that tolerance, and there's nothing wrong with doing that, but overheating is still a thing. In fact, many users have reported overheating in less than 20 minutes. Now, I personally did not experience that. Granted, it's winter where I live, and I've been going through a cold front. I mean, it's been as cold as it'll probably get all year where I live. So I haven't had issues. Another thing I want to point out is that I have kept the display off body, because anyone who's a Sony user knows historically you want to keep as much off body, off of where all the action happens, as possible. But what I'm really getting to is that if you need video, if that's really what you're after solely, you should be looking at something like the FX3 or the A7S III, because those are the cameras that are less prone to overheating, especially the FX3 with the active cooling. Another reason I went with it, even if it doesn't have an EVF. And that's how you eliminate these sort of issues. Of course, no crop, because that's a 12 megapixel sensor. Here we're dealing with 33 megapixels that inevitably takes us down a road where cropping it is going to be the most efficient way to pull off 4K 60. Now, I personally don't see the crop as that big of a deal, but enough users have complained about it that I can't pretend that it isn't an issue. And I understand why. I mean, I don't want a crop on 4K 60, but it's still something that reminds you this is a hybrid. And if you really want that video camera, if you want, continuous shooting without overheating being an issue in most situations, you have to look to another model. So it's not Sony being greedy. It's a matter of the expectations of a hybrid versus a cinema or a video camera. I really think it's pretty straightforward, and it's an expectation that you need to be realistic about. Another issue when it comes to video is the rolling shutter. Now, you may have seen demonstrations that show it's pretty bad, but in my experience, that's not the case. In fact, most of those demonstrations will require someone going like this. And if that's not the most ridiculous thing, I don't know what is. And I'm not saying that we don't need those sort of tests. I just don't know who actually films like that. Even sports photographers, videographers that are dealing with fast-moving objects, they generally don't film like that. So while, it's relevant for me to bring up the fact that rolling shutter is here, I feel like to spend too much time on it is a little bit absurd. Now, when it comes to the menu system, big improvement. For someone who's been in Sony, in their realm of cameras for a long time, like myself, I was not as critical as many other users, but people coming from other manufacturers, and I'm not going to make this that, you couldn't be a Sony user for a decade or 20 years. 20 is kind of pushing it because, they hadn't acquired Konica Minolta yet. But the premise being that if you were unhappy with the menu system, you've got to be much happier now. And the ease of navigating it, being able to seamlessly jump through the settings, is much nicer than in generations past. Does that mean that I don't think this could be better? No. And if you follow my channel over the years and even in the last year, you already know that I would like to see even more improvement on this side. I mean, Sony has a phenomenal smartphone business. There's no reason that they can't integrate that sort of technology into their camera business. And we're starting to scratch the surface of that with more photocentric Xperia phones. The question is, when will those capabilities in terms of touchscreen and just really nice tech make their way to the really nice digital imaging sensors and autofocus systems that we're talking about in a camera like the a7IV, the A1, and the next generation of a7R, a7S, and A9. You get the picture. Now, and I wasn't trying to be cute with that. Another thing to be aware of is that now that the a7C exists, this camera is no longer the entry level. So once upon a time, all of one generation ago, the a7 III really was the entry level position in the mirrorless full frame lineup for Sony. That's no longer the case. So I feel like that's another reason this camera went up in price, and it's just something to be aware of. As long as the a7C is around, and I think it will stay, I think it's popular for a reason. I like it. I don't own one, but I understand the appeal. Having a small form factor that can still shoot great stills and video, not as good as this camera, but can get close, is something to really enjoy, especially if you've got back problems. I've got them, so you don't need to wonder about that. What would draw me to a lighter camera? And when the time comes that Sony makes something lighter that is even more feature-rich, I'm probably going to pick one up. But for now, when it comes to, again, that balance of high megapixel resolution as well as great video features, this camera really does have it. Having the dual slots that support Compact Flash Express Type A is another nicety that frankly didn't have to be there, but Sony's making it standard, and that's a good thing. The Bluetooth connectivity, I'm not going to, or the Wi-Fi, I'm not going to wave a flag about and tell you that it's amazing, because those are things that are a given and that we expect. I think the biggest critique on the video side is the overheating. I've made mention, and I've already told all of you that if that is something that would prevent you from buying this, you should look elsewhere. If you respect that it's a hybrid and treat it as such, I think you will be rewarded. Now, when it comes to I/O, very good. I mean, no complaints. By the way, weather sealing, as usual, seems good on this camera. That's not really an exception. I mean, Sony, every generation, at least tells us they've improved it. This is part of that club. So multi-port for Sony accessories, Type-C for charging, headphone, microphone jack, so everything you'd expect there. No charger comes with this camera. So be aware, you will be buying a third-party charger most likely, and I've covered those. There's nothing wrong with them. And then you have a full-size HDMI out. So certainly, I think good I/O, nothing to complain about. Now, had they introduced a new battery type, I feel like this camera would benefit from it, no question, because you don't like to see a generational improvement like this where every facet of the camera is better and then battery life isn't. It just is a little bit illogical. However, I think it's still acceptable. You can, of course, get a vertical grip or just get additional batteries. So it's not the end of the world, but it did take a hit that is noteworthy. But that will really amount more to how much of a hybrid shooter you actually are. And I think that's what they anticipate, is that people are going to use this now that it has, really competent video between the color science, the 10-bit across the board. Granted, there's no 4K 120, but, at $2,500, 4K 120 is not really part of the conversation. You still have S&Q, you can do a lot there, but, 4K 120 is just not part of the conversation. And the S&Q is mostly, I'm not going to call it flat out gimmick, but it is to some degree, because in post, if you have great footage, you can do most of that. But if you want it built into the camera, Sony's done a lot of things right here. Again, autofocus is just fantastic. It makes a lot of Sony's glass look even better, or I should say, the other way around, that the glass paired with this is really a little bit of heaven when it comes to shooting in a hybrid capacity, and Sony really has improved on that. The focus breathing, it's still there, but the way it's treated, whether it's that they're basically employing a little bit of a crop factor in order to soften out some of what we've experienced over the years in their growing pains of focus breathing. However you want to look at it, Sony claims it is part of the new AF system and the fact that it is actively pursuing your subject through algorithms. All I know is it is pleasing to the eye. I'm sure you've looked at footage from this camera, and it could fool you into thinking that it is a much more expensive camera. But ultimately, this is a hybrid, and I keep coming back to that because I feel like expectations need to be tempered. People need to understand that this is a camera that can do both. I wouldn't say that it is not great at doing either of them. Some people insist that if you have a hybrid, you're kind of conceding that, I know it's not going to be excellent for still or video. I think that's a bit of poo-pooing that is unrealistic. This camera does a phenomenal job when it comes to taking stills. It definitely can be used for professional work as long as said professional work does not require extraordinarily large print size. If you require that, you need to look to the a7R lineup. And that's always been the case. It's not new. People who act as if it, is a new thing just don't know what they're talking about. So I think we need to get that out of the way. And when it comes to video, as I've already stated, if you really need the pro video capacity, and that's what you're after, this just isn't the right camera. It comes close, but it's still not there. So when I refer to like average consumers, prosumers, you're going to be so happy with this thing. You're going to wish you had it yesterday, a year ago, and just be glad it exists now, even at a higher price, because it really is that good of a camera. But if you're a pro who's looking to replace gear you've used for video in the past, this probably isn't the right camera. In spite of everything that it does right with video, it just still isn't something that I think you can rely on for paid gigs. And some people will make the argument for still as well. But again, if that still capacity doesn't require extremely large prints, I think this is more than acceptable. Frankly, we're encroaching with the 33 megapixel sensor, the a7R II. And granted, the a7R II is old, but it's a stalwart. I mean, it is well respected. Yes, it doesn't have the autofocus system. It doesn't have the newer battery. It doesn't have many of the modern luxuries that we enjoy now with Sony cameras, but it's still excellent. That's the reason I still own it and I didn't sell it. So, what is the ultimate takeaway about this camera? I think it easily lives up to its A7 lineage, which is where the game all began for full frame with Sony. I think that it does everything really well. Again, understand limitations. When it comes to ergonomics, I think it is vastly improved over the previous generation. The flippy screen versus the older screen that's still used on the A1, if you like it, then you're going to be really happy. The touchscreen works well. Do I think it's an amazing touchscreen? Absolutely not. I think Sony still has a ways to go. I think these displays can be larger. I think that it leaves a lot to be desired, and we're just scratching the surface. But if you're trying to decide between, this camera and a previous gen, specifically the a7 III, I recommend going with this. Now, if you own the a7 III, I would only upgrade to this if you know that all of a sudden it is going to change the way you work or enjoy your hobby because you have a feature set that simply didn't exist on the previous gen. And it does provide that. I mean, even from a usability standpoint, this EVF and this display are worlds better. Maybe not the display, but the touchscreen and menu system, I think, amount to it being worlds better than the a7 III. In terms of the dials, redesign here, you have an additional dial. It just means more customization. Some people are complaining about it. Some people are praising it. To me, if more customization is more to you, well, you've got it. It's one of those things you could take it or leave it. I don't think that it dynamically changes the product, but it may change the way you work with it in terms of presets. That may be a big deal. So, working on the fly, customizing the camera to what you need to do, shooting in either still or video, or maybe having 3 presets dedicated to still, 3 presets dedicated to video. I think it's a nice thing to have. That's my personal opinion on what they've changed with this versus the previous generation. And quite a bit has changed. I mean, it is very different in just about every way. So that's why I say if you are shopping this camera versus the a7 III, I don't think there's anything to shop. I think you get this knowing that it's better in every possible way except for battery life. And quite frankly, because you can buy generic batteries now, they're affordable, and you're going to have to buy a charger anyway, right? Why not go with the a7IV. When it comes to comparing this to something like, again, the a7R4, wait for a dedicated video from me to do that as opposed to this. The review is just about whether or not this camera is, I think, worthy of the hype it has already received, and I think it absolutely is. I mean, ultimately, everything, as I've stated over and over again, is improved, except for battery life. And active steady shot, if that is of any value to you, I welcome it all the time because Sony has been notorious for not giving us, electronic stabilization improvements that you can find in pieces of junk like GoPros. So why not see something in pro-grade cameras or cameras like this that kind of, straddle the line between pro and consumer-based products? And that's the beauty of the a7IV. This can be an ideal, I wouldn't say primary camera for wedding photographers, but I think that's the direction they're heading. I think the A1 is really that ultimate tool, and this is, again, a good B camera. I wouldn't make it my A camera if I was shooting weddings personally. It has a lot to offer, but the A1 is the way to go. Alternatively, if you already have something, stick with what works. But if any of the features this brings together, from the improved color science, autofocus, EVF improvement, display, and I would say most importantly the fact that 10-bit is now available across the board, the 4K 60 is a compromise. Otherwise, this thing is just an excellent tool. It's just not designed to do one job. And I think too many people are trying to, put this in a box. And a hybrid like this, which is my favorite kind of camera, isn't something that's going to be put into a single box. So as long as you understand all of that, you won't regret this purchase. It is easily one of the best cameras on the market. Again, a baby, or I should say a $2,500 version of the A1, as I dubbed it before. And who knows, that may end up being the title of this video, because that's what I feel like it is. It is, if the A1 was dumbed down to a $2,500 camera, this is what it would look like, feel like, perform like. And hey, even with the 10 frames per second, this is still an excellent camera because of how accurate the autofocus is. And that tracking in video is another huge element that does separate it. Not just the codecs, not just 10-bit or 4K 60. So I really like it, highly recommend it. Don't think you'll go wrong. It's a great pairing with the 70-200 f2.8 Mark II. But any G Master lens is going to live happily. Even a lens like this, which, by the way, if you opt to go with this versus something like an a7R4, or of course an A1, but more so the a7R4, and you save yourself $1,000, this is the type of lens I would pick up instantly. All utility, all purpose. But of course, if you know you need to shoot something specific that requires primes, then you don't need that advice. But this is a really good example of a lens that's only a little over $1,000 and routinely has been on sale close to $1,000. That is a phenomenal, I would say almost a perfect pairing for the a7IV. And of course, there are newer lenses, but when it comes to versatility, and I think who the a7IV really, again, in a broad breadth appeals to, this is the lens I would own all day long utilizing this camera. And that pretty much sums things up. Great sensor, great overall performance, just a little less battery life, which I think is a reasonable trade-off for having a camera that is better in every single way. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them, hit that like button, and as usual, please feel free to subscribe, and please stay safe. Later.